my generation and older are addicted to these products in a way that Gen Z starting to recognize is dangerous and unhealthy and are starting to walk away from. Now, granted, they may be going to other products that are just equally as addictive. They might be choosing TikTok or other alternatives. But as someone who works in a context with Gen Z transition to Gen Alpha and some Gen Z college students, they are far more aware. And I think that's something we have to take more seriously, is that we can and should be acting in the best interest of the next generations. And we should not tolerate products that are designed to specifically target younger generations and keep them in a state of addiction. And we have to take the log out of our own eye so that we can see clearly enough to take the speck out of the eye of somebody else. You're listening to What Would Jesus Tech, a podcast between a pastor, a professor, and a product manager on how Christians should approach technology with the mind of Christ. My name is Austin. I am the director of youth for Redeemer Christian Church in Amarillo, Texas, the pastor of this trio, and my other two companions are out today. Andrew has a child that is sick, and Joel has some work obligations that he has to tend to, and so it's just going to be me today. We normally don't do solo episodes, but in this case, just to keep our momentum going and give you, dear listeners, something to listen to on this week, we decided that I would just do a quick solo episode on something that I recently wrote about and something that was in the news recently and something that I do think is important for Christians to know about and at least be informed about. And that's the recent major verdict against Meta and Google from a landmark jury decision out of a case in California. On March 25th, a California jury handed a verdict against Google and Meta, finding both companies guilty of knowingly and negligently making their products addictive to minors. And the court ordered that both companies pay a young woman named Kaylee, who was the plaintiff of the case, and argued that both Meta and Google, and by Google meaning YouTube, were responsible for her childhood addiction to social media. The court ordered that both companies pay her $3 million in compensatory damages and then another $3 million in punitive damages. So a $6 million verdict for a young woman who successfully argued to a jury of her peers that Meta and Google/YouTube, and I'm just going to use them both interchangeably as I talk, knowingly made something that knowingly sought to keep her in a state of addiction to their products and triggered a lifetime of unintended consequences, mental health issues, body image issues, and the like. It's a pretty big verdict in and of itself, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about what exactly the verdict entails, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about just how significant this one case is for the wrong reasons. And so I want to walk through just some of the details of the case and also walk through some things that we need to think about and keep in the front of our mind as we hear about this case or as news about the fallout of this case comes and goes. So first and foremost, I think it needs to be said that whatever may come of the appeals phase of this trial, this case is not over yet. Just because the verdict has been handed down doesn't mean it's a done deal yet. There will be a very lengthy appeals process here. We need to stop and acknowledge that this is a pretty significant moment in the growing anti-social media movement. Last year, or I guess 2024 last year, I had predicted that 2025 was going to be the year that the social media backlash gained real significant momentum at the grassroots level. And this is a really important step in that unfolding story. For the very first time, a jury of regular Americans have confirmed something that has been obvious to anyone who has worked with minors in any way, shape, or form for the past 15 years or longer. And it's important because this is a jury of regular people. These are not tech writers. These are not educational activists. These are not government watchdog groups. These are normal people like you and me who were tasked with evaluating whether Meta and YouTube created products knowingly and negligently with the intent of keeping children addicted to them. And the jury found that, yes, Meta and Google both did this. Now, the verdict was not unanimous, and that's a really important point, that there were two jurors who did not fully sign on to the verdict as delivered by the majority, but it doesn't change the fact that these two massive companies who have otherwise been able to maybe successfully evade justice or successfully evade guilty verdicts for other forms of misbehavior have now been held into account, or been held to account for the first time by ordinary people through the legal process of the countries wherein they reside. We're not talking about TikTok here. TikTok is a Chinese company dealing with litigation against a Chinese company on American soil is not the most straightforward. But when it comes to two American companies, they were found guilty by regular American citizens of knowingly harming the American public. And whatever happens from the jury, whatever happens from the appeals process, that is a big deal. That's actually a really significant step. But we also need to consider what is the impact of this particular case itself, because there's a lot of excitement about the outcome of this case that I think is misplaced. And we can start with kind of an easy low-hanging fruit, and that's just simply the damages assigned to the plaintiff, to this young woman named Kaylee. $6 million in damages makes for a great headline, but for Meta and Google, this doesn't even register as pocket change. Both companies regularly pay court-ordered penalties magnitudes larger than this, just as a routine cost of doing business. This is just something that they have to spend money on in order to do the business that they need to do. There was a similar case happening at the same time as the California case in New Mexico, and in that case, the jury ordered Meta to pay $375 million back to the state for unfair and deceptive practices. But for a company that just blew $80 billion, with a B, dollars on its failed metaverse endeavor, $375 million is also too small to even count as pocket change. That would be akin to finding perhaps a nickel or a dime in your jeans one day. As two of the biggest tech companies in America today, Meta and Google, and we could also include Amazon or Apple, you could fill in the blank here on some other ones, they could take these kind of financial hits over and over again and not even blink. To the average person, $6 million sounds like a lot. And if you won $6 million in a court case and that was awarded to you for the damages and for the wrongs that you suffered, that would be a life-changing amount of money. And that was something to be thankful for. But when it comes to the pocketbooks of Google and Meta, $6 million is almost not even worth writing about. Like that's almost an asterisk or a footnote to what's going on here, just because that doesn't do anything to these companies in any way, shape, or form. But where this does get interesting and why this case is truly so significant is that one case like this is not going to, Facebook or Meta and Google are not even going to blink at this. But because of the fact pattern of this case and because of the nature of the argument made in this case, there are now potentially thousands of plaintiffs waiting in the wings to file similar cases against Meta and Google, and given the similar fact patterns and similar arguments, can have a reasonable hope for similar outcomes. Now, those outcomes aren't guaranteed. The judge may rule differently. The jury may rule differently. These are not guaranteed to happen for every single person that tries to take this specific line of argument. But with the volume of cases yet to be filed, $6 million by itself or $375 million by itself won't add up to too much. But if you multiply this 1,000 times over, now suddenly that's going to put some pressure on these companies, because it's not only going to be the verdict and the damages assigned for these companies to pay, but it's going to be the time spent for their legal teams, for their legal departments to continue to make the best defenses that they can make in all of the places where these cases are happening. But there's no sign yet that there's anything of a class action lawsuit forming against these companies here, which would be a whole different ballgame that would change everything pretty rapidly. But so long as a flood, an avalanche of individual cases similar to this one remain to be seen and are waiting to be filed and litigated, this one result by itself may not do anything, but if you multiply that out hundreds or thousands of times over, then yeah, that might put some serious pressure, some financial pressure on both Meta and Google. They may still be perfectly fine at the end of the day, but it's going to amount to something that exponentially becomes more taxing to them as companies beyond just the damages that they would have to pay out. This also relates to something that I think is really important too when it comes to thinking about Meta and Google both as companies and what exactly they were found at fault for here. They were found at fault for Facebook, the platform, the social media platform, and Instagram and YouTube as being products that were created that knowingly kept minors addicted to their products, and the jury found that was true. But when we think of Meta, and this is kind of harder to do with Meta, it's easier to do with Google. In both cases, both companies have a diverse range of product portfolios, and they could lose their cash cows and recover from that. They could both lose the products that they were found guilty for having created and knowingly let run amok. And both companies would still survive. Admittedly, Google would be in better shape. Meta is quietly building a new era for itself through its hardware line that doesn't get the attention it deserves. I wrote about it last year for the Gospel Coalition on their smart glasses, and that has only continued to just experience a meteoric rise in use and adoption. They are absolutely succeeding, similar to what Apple did with the Apple Watch and kind of creating a new product category of smartwatches. Meta is absolutely doing this with smart glasses, and they are seeing tremendous success for it, and it's not getting the attention that I think it deserves. Meta is no longer just a social media company anymore, and it hasn't really been for a while. It's also been a data company and an advertising company, but now it's a hardware category or hardware company in a way that it's never been before, and that's really important. Google, of course, has its entire G Suite of products. It has Gmail. It has the entire Google search engine is still by far the most used search engine on the planet, and all of the advertising infrastructure that goes into that. Google could lose YouTube and not blink. They would suffer for that in some ways. They would take a hit to their functionality in some ways, but they would be okay. They would get through this just fine. The scale of these companies is truly incomprehensible to the average person. I don't even think Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet, can even grasp themselves just the magnitude, the immensity of the companies that they lead. This would be a big deal to us as ordinary people if something were to happen to Instagram and Meta's control over it, and to YouTube and Google's control over it, but these companies are almost unfathomably immense, and we have to remember that. But let's talk about the case itself and the argument that was made at the case, because the argument in this case was not exactly novel, but it was certainly interesting, and obviously it was successful. The argument in the California case, not the New Mexico case, was that Meta and Google were knowingly operating like the social media equivalent of big tobacco. And big tobacco refers to a phase of the American economy where you have the major tobacco companies operating in a way as to get as many Americans hooked on tobacco as possible, knowingly concealing research on the harmful and dangerous effects of tobacco, working to promote cigarette use as not just healthy for you in some instances, but culturally acceptable and cool. You want to be a cool kid, you're going to smoke a Marlboro or a Camel or something like that. And that Meta and Google were knowingly operating in a similar way, using a similar playbook. The 1998 Master Settlement Agreement saw the nation come together to hold the four biggest tobacco companies in the United States responsible for having engaged in a cooperative effort, for the lack of a better word, to make tobacco a maximally addictive product and one that you just couldn't resist and say no to. But even while I think that argument does have some merit, and I do think the comparison between Meta and Google, two the big tobacco companies that were responsible for that, and were included in that settlement. I don't have them off the top of my head right now. Well, I do think that comparison is apt, and I do think that Meta and Google were knowingly acting in very similar ways and using a similar playbook. I do think that fundamental argument is flawed. And I do think Meta and Google are actually going to see some weaknesses in that argument and take advantage of it. So let me explain what I mean by that. Meta and Google and Amazon and other big tech companies to a certain extent want you to believe that you are powerless. They want you to believe that you have no choice or control about whether you'll use their products. That is the entire point of their existence. And that is the entire point of the current monopolized economy of the American West, where we have what was formerly FANG, has now become the Magnificent Seven, as these economic oligarchies that you can't escape even if you wanted to. You can try to get around them. You can try to get away from them, but it's very costly to do so. It's very costly to say no and to try to work around these. And while that is true to a certain extent, it's also something that these companies have a very strong interest in making you believe that you couldn't help it, that you didn't have a choice, that you are helpless, and that you will do whatever it is that they want you to do. They want you to believe that you are fundamentally incapable of saying no to something and paying the price that comes with it. And that's where the comparison between Meta and Google and big tobacco is at its strongest. That is what both companies, both eras, both situations have a lot of overlap. They both share the desire to advance this lie that you are incapable of saying no, that you do not have a way to get out of using the things that they have created. Now, saying no is often a pricey thing to do, and that price is often very steep. But wanting to say no and being able to say no are two different things. And what both big tobacco and big tech want you to believe is that you're not able to say no. You don't have the ability to say no, regardless of how much you may want to say no. It doesn't matter how much you hate this. It doesn't matter how gross or icky or worse this makes you feel. You're not able to say no because of the circumstances that they created. But this is where I think that analogy starts to get weak and fall apart. The big tobacco comparison for how Meta and Google, that works insofar as it compares how the two groups are acting. And I think that comparison is very apt in terms of the behavior of both groups. But the products are substantially different. The differences are significant. Both groups target minors, and the role that parents play in giving their children these products is different. I'm going to restate that again. We might have to cut that out and trim that out because I think I butchered the line here. The two differences between big tobacco and big tech that we really need to focus on here, despite the similarities in how they behave, is that when it comes to their products, both groups targeted minors in different ways, and parents played a different role in giving their children an addictive product. See, cigarettes and tobacco were insidious because cigarettes are small, they're easy to give to children, they're easy to hide from parents. You can get them at a playground, at a bus stop, a field trip. Children can get a hold of a cigarette quietly and easily without parents ever knowing about it, regardless if the parents themselves smoke or not. It was easier for tobacco products to kind of circulate in places where it doesn't matter what your family policy was at home, whether your parents smoked or not. Once you got to school or once you got to the park or whatever, it was off limits. It was easier for those things to pass around. But in contrast, most children were knowingly exposed, to keep the analogy going, to Instagram and YouTube by their parents. It would be the equivalent of parents giving their children, a cigarette instead of a friend from school or a random individual at the park giving them one. Painting Meta and Google as the equivalent of big tobacco leaves the largest consumer base for both groups entirely unscathed. And that's the millennial, Gen X, and boomer addicts who, while in the case of big tech, were railing about how dangerous social media addiction is, are unwilling to practice what they preach. Now, granted, if this continues the way that it is, we will see some positive results that are worth celebrating. If this anti-social media movement continues the way that it is, we will see a substantial hit to social media addiction and social media harm and other issues among Gen Z and Gen Alpha and younger generations of Americans, very similar to what happened as a result of the legal campaign against big tobacco. For a period of time, tobacco usage among millennials and Gen Z took a pretty substantial hit. And that's a good thing, and that's something to worth celebrate, although cards on the table, and just to be completely transparent here, I don't have a problem with tobacco in principle, and I do occasionally smoke a pipe myself. But just like the tobacco industry today, Meta and Google can take a substantial hit to their usage among younger generations, and they will still be kept afloat by older generations who are going to take those addictions to their graves. It doesn't matter if Meta and Google are able to successfully capture newer and newer generations of users and get them addicted to their products, when they can be entirely kept afloat by older generations who are able to continue to bankroll their entire existence. I mean, again, just to the extent that these organizations are so monstrously immense. You can't go to a gas station today and not see, or to a grocery store and still not see the presence of big tobacco everywhere. And even though Gen Z and Gen Alpha are not as much of tobacco users as maybe my generations were, as my generation was, and generations older than me, where that was more of a live issue, they haven't gone anywhere. They're still here. They're still kicking. They're still successful, even though the kind of stigma around tobacco has taken a sharp hit, and it's not as cool to smoke tobacco as it was when I was a child growing up. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's still very much here, and it's still going to be here for the next several decades, while boomers and Gen Xers and millennials continue to age up and continue to use these products. And that's the exact same situation that Meta and Google will find themselves in. Even if Meta and Google were to lose all of their Gen Z aged users, I know this sounds hard to believe, but even if they were to lose all of their Gen Z users, they would be okay. They would be just fine, because the millennial and Gen X and boomer usage of these products far eclipses, at this point, the amount of Gen Z users and the extent of Gen Z users. Because we, my generation and older, are addicted to these products in a way that Gen Z starting to recognize is dangerous and unhealthy and are starting to walk away from. Now, granted, they may be going to other products that are just equally as addictive. They might be choosing TikTok or other alternatives. But as someone who works in a context with Gen Z transition to Gen Alpha and some Gen Z college students, they are far more aware, like not just intellectually aware, but existentially aware of the dangers of social media, really, than most of my friends are as a millennial and older. And I think that's something we have to take more seriously, is that we can and should be acting in the best interest of the next generations. And we should not tolerate products that are designed to specifically target younger generations and keep them in a state of addiction. And we have to take the log out of our own eye so that we can see clearly enough to take the speck out of the eye of somebody else. Now, and a couple of other quicker thoughts is that, one, This verdict is more than enough for every school board across the country to enact Jonathan Haidt's recommendations for smartphone usage in public schools. And just to carry the big tobacco analogy one more time further, you wouldn't let somebody peddle cigarettes or other tobacco products in a school or on school property. Treat phones like you would any other drug vector and kick them out. Next, it would also take 2 or 3 years, like we talked about earlier, for the full ramifications of this case to play out. And if what's happening in Europe isn't any indication, it's possible for the cure to be worse than the disease. Freya India, who is one of the best voices on the harms of social media and Gen Z, and I'm pretty excited to read her upcoming book here in a couple of weeks, recently wrote in a piece for the Free Press that in Britain, her home country, and I'm going to give an extended quote here, quote, "The solutions being pushed by the state are causing a new kind of harm. Meta should feel this heat. They deserve what's coming. But I worry about what's coming for us, too. Because if I've learned anything from years of writing about what's happening to young people, it's that everything can and will be capitalized on and exploited, especially a generation in crisis." Now, what she means by that is that in response to a level of control that the European Union has begun to exert on American tech companies, they're much further down the road on assigning and condemning these companies for being harmful influences on society. But their solution for this is to enact what is, it's in some ways, a kind of de facto police state on social media usage. We don't have time to go super deep into this right now because I don't want to do another episode within an episode. But in the UK right now, there are some very draconian anti-social media speech laws that are not just being passed, but also enforced. And people are being dragged off to jail for things that they say on social media that the government deems harmful. And this is all in direct response to the correct belief of the UK government that social media is dangerous and harmful to society and needs to be controlled. The diagnosis is correct. But just because you get the diagnosis right doesn't mean that you get the prescription right. And it is possible to get the diagnosis right. And as what we're seeing in the United Kingdom right now, the diagnosis can actually make the problem worse in its own way. You can maybe treat some of the symptoms, maybe even attack the underlying cause, but the end result, the net effect, is worse. And that's something we need to keep our minds on going forward, is that, yes, we don't want Meta and Google or any other tech company to have just free reign to target children or minors with knowingly addictive products. And as bad as that is, it can also be worse for completely different reasons. We can't just assume that just because we have maybe success here in this area that it means things are automatically going to get better. The job is not done yet. This is an important piece in building the legal and regulatory floor of the anti-social media and smartphone movement. There are more planks yet to be added, and all of the momentum is in the direction of adding more planks to the floor, of building this floor out and making it stronger. But the point of a floor is to support a ceiling. And supporters of this movement have a vision for what that ceiling is. They know what they're after. They know what they're going for. They actually have a very clear-eyed view of what it would mean to build a ceiling of success for this movement once they get the floor reliably built. But the question remains is whether others can catch that vision, can catch that dream once the enthusiasm for building that floor has passed. The pro-life movement here in the States caught its white whale that had been chasing for 50 years at the Supreme Court in 2022, and support for abortion is now the highest it's ever been. Laws and court rulings are important, but changed hearts and a desire to live well in the world God has made is even more important. And while we can and should find co-belligerency where we can with secular or with secular activists or other people or people from other religions on this front, and while we should be able to lock hands on this one cause, we do need to keep in mind that for the Christian, the goal is not simply to aim at tech and media habits. Those are important. Those are vital. Our society is in the way that it is because we don't have any of those as a whole. But no amount of success in social activism or political and legal activism on this front can substitute for Christ and changed hearts and minds that come through the Holy Spirit by faith in Him in response to His gospel. And whatever we may say about the successes or failures or challenges of the anti-smartphone and social media movement, Christians have an obligation to go one step further and call people to something even higher than what the anti-smartphone and social media movement wants. And to be clear, they want a lot of good things. They want better childhoods for our children. They want our children to be able to learn and study better. They want our teenagers and youth to be in healthier relationships than they have been for the past 15 years. And that's great, and it's good to want those things. But Christians should want all of that and more. Christians should want all of that and something that smartphones and social media do regularly distract from. And that is knowledge of Christ, knowledge of His word, and faith in Him through the hearing of the gospel. And so while we should celebrate this, while we should recognize this as being a good thing, even though it may not be quite everything that some people may hope it to be, and there's still a lot yet to be seen, the calling of Christians in this time and in this place carries on, regardless if the appeals process doesn't go the way that we want it to, regardless if big tech exploits some of those weaknesses in the argument that was made for this particular case, regardless of what happens here. The call of Christians goes forward regardless of what happens with the anti-social media movement. Even though there's a lot of good things going for that right now, it is not a movement that will endure to eternity the way that Christ and His church will. So this has been a quicker episode of What Would Jesus Tech? If you enjoyed this and if you want to see more episodes like this, you can let us know by joining our Discord. We have a free Discord that is totally open for people to join. You do not need to be a member of our Patreon, although if you want to keep your What Would Jesus Tech listening experience ad-free, that is the best way to do that. We want this to be a high-quality show. We want this to be a well-made show, and your direct financial support makes that possible so that we don't have to worry about dealing with advertisers and sponsoring products that we don't believe in, and I don't have to give canned readings of ad scripts for things that I've never bought and I've never intend to use and I know are not actually going to pay the bills. That ball's in y'all's court. Go to our Patreon, support us financially, but even if you don't want to support us financially, come join us in our Discord server. It's chill, it's free, it's very laid back, and it's a lot of fun. This has been Austin Gravely for What Would Jesus Tech? Use tech, find rest, and glorify God. We'll see y'all next week.